A shocking assassination attempt at the White House and a massive Supreme Court ruling have just collided, reshaping the very survival of American democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds exactly like the plot of a political thriller, right?
Oh,
But the documents we're digging into today show a reality that is, well, it's far more complex and honestly much more consequential.
right. Just picture the scene for a second. It's a Saturday night in Washington, D.C. The White House Correspondents' dinner is in full swing. This is, the ultimate insider event, a night where politicians and the press are just rubbing shoulders.
Oh, and they have an entertainer on stage, right? Like a mentalist named Oz Perlman is performing.
Exactly. So laughter is filling the room. And then, completely without warning, gunfire cuts through the applause. A gunman opens fire on former President Donald Trump. Chaos instantly strikes the ballroom. Secret Service agents swarm the floor. Within seconds, this entire evening of celebration transforms into an active crime scene.
It's just terrifying to think about.
Right. Now, I want you to hold that terrifying image of physical vulnerability in your mind and just rewind a few days earlier to a completely silent room. The Supreme Court hands down a 6-3 ruling in a case called Louisiana v. Callais. With a single decision, the court fundamentally rewrites the rules of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, basically sending an earthquake through the whole American electoral system.
Yeah, and, at first glance, these two events, the sudden gunfire in a crowded room and the quiet strike of a judge's gavel, they seem entirely disconnected.
Totally.
But as we comb through these legal opinions, the police reports, the political fallout, a really clear theme emerges. Both events are these powerful symbols of a nation wrestling with intense political fractures. I mean, we're looking at a system experiencing severe vulnerability, both in the physical safety of its leaders and in the legal architecture of its elections.
Absolutely. And look, before we get any further, we need to be really clear about something. Today, we are looking at some incredibly charged information. We've got everything from blistering Supreme Court dissents to political demands to literally a shooter's manifesto.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. So our goal today is not to tell you who is right or to take a side in these massive cultural debates. Our mission in this deep dive is simply to pull back the curtain on the arguments both sides are using. We just want to break down the facts and the legal mechanics exactly as they appear in the original materials so you can see exactly how the rules of the game are shifting right under your feet.
Right, impartial analysis, plain and simple. So let's start with that legal earthquake at the Supreme Court. The ruling in Louisiana v. Callais, it centers on how we draw the boundary lines for our elections. Specifically, the court looked at Louisiana's congressional map, focusing on District 6.
Okay, so what was the deal with District 6?
Well, the state had originally drawn this specific district to be a second-majority black district. And they did this because a lower federal court previously instructed them that the Voting Rights Act actually required it, to ensure fair representation.
But the Supreme Court steps in and completely reverses that directive, right?
Yeah.
In a 6-3 decision, the court strikes down the District 6 map, ruling that it's an unconstitutional racial gerrymander.
Exactly. And to understand what that actually means, we have to look at the mechanics of the law. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was designed to prevent states from drawing maps that dilute the voting power of minority groups.
Right.
So for decades, courts used this specific legal test to figure out if a map violated this rule. It's known as the Jingles framework, and it's guided mapmakers for like 40 years.
Wow, 40 years. So it's heavily established.
Right. But in this new ruling, Justice Samuel Alito, who wrote for the conservative majority, fundamentally updates how this framework is applied. He argues that mapmakers cannot use race as the primary reason for drawing a district boundary unless they can prove intentional discrimination is actively taking place.
Oh, interesting. So you can't just look at a map, notice a demographic imbalance, and draw a new line based on race to hit a specific representation target.
Exactly. Justice Alito points out that the political landscape today is vastly different from the civil rights era of 1965. And to back up his argument, he cites a very specific statistic.
Yeah, this part stood out to me. He notes that in 2 of the 5 most recent nationwide elections, black voters actually turned out at higher rates than white voters.
Yes, and he uses this data point to illustrate that massive social changes occurred, and therefore these aggressive racial interventions required by the old interpretation of the law, well, they're just no longer justified.
But he also issues a stark warning about how the law is being manipulated behind the scenes, right? He argues that politicians are hiding partisan gerrymandering behind claims of racial equality.
Yeah, and to really grasp this, we need to talk about packing and cracking, which is like the bread and butter of gerrymandering.
Okay, packing and cracking. Give me the breakdown.
Okay, imagine you're trying to share a pizza with someone who loves pepperoni, but you want to make sure you get as much plain cheese as possible.
Always a relatable struggle.
Right. So if you take all the pepperoni and shove it onto just 1 or 2 slices, you've packed it. The pepperoni lover gets those slices, but you get the rest of the entire pizza. Or you could crack it by spreading a tiny bit of pepperoni across every single slice, ensuring no single slice is dominated by it.
Ah, okay. And politicians do this exact same thing with voters. They pack their opponents into a single district, so they win that one district by a massive margin, but they lose the surrounding 5 districts.
Exactly. Or they crack their opponents across multiple districts, so they never have a majority anywhere.
Wow. And Alito is warning that map makers are drawing these deeply manipulative political boundaries to protect their own political parties. But then when they get sued, they run into the courtroom and claim they drew the lines to comply with the Voting Rights Act's rules on race.
Yes. Alito's core argument is that the courts absolutely must disentangle race from politics. If a state legislature draws lines specifically to protect Republican or Democratic incumbents, which is a purely political goal, the federal courts cannot strike that map down under the Voting Rights Act just because those political lines happen to impact black voters. The burden of proof is now on the challengers to prove that race, not political party, was the actual driving factor.
But let's pause and look at the friction here. Because, if we think about this like a sports game, where the teams get to draw their own boundary lines on the field while the game is being played, untangling race and politics seems almost biologically impossible in some states.
Oh, for sure.
Like, if race and political affiliation are deeply correlated, if one team's most loyal fans all happen to belong to the same demographic and live on the same side of town, moving the boundary line hurts that demographic, no matter what excuse the team uses in court. So how can a judge realistically separate a political motive from a racial outcome when they look exactly the same on the ground?
And that is the exact dilemma that Justice Elena Kagan raises in her fierce dissent. She represents the liberal viewpoint on the court in this case, and she argues that untangling them is impossible. And by pretending we can, the majority opinion essentially guts the law.
Right. She uses some really strong language.
Yeah.
She writes that this ruling makes Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act a dead letter.
A dead letter, yeah. She's arguing that the court has set the bar so incredibly high that it becomes nearly impossible for average citizens to prove their votes are being diluted. Because, think about it, if a state can deflect a racial discrimination lawsuit simply by claiming they drew the lines to gain a political advantage, then the Voting Rights Act loses all its enforcement power.
Right, it's like a built-in loophole. And Kagan outlines a very specific fear for the future here. She warns that this ruling will cause the largest drop in minority representation since the era following Reconstruction.
Exactly. Her argument is that without the threat of Section 2 enforcement, state legislatures will just have a free hand to dismantle minority-majority districts under the guise of everyday partisan politics.
So as you're listening to this, think about how your own neighborhood is drawn on a map. Think about those invisible lines that cut down the middle of your street, separating your house from the house across the way. This Supreme Court ruling literally changes the mechanics of whether your vote carries weight or just gets swallowed up by a neighboring district.
It really does. The fundamental rules of how political power is distributed have shifted. And when the federal rules shift like this, it creates an immediate ripple effect for the people actually trying to run for office under these new lines.
And we actually see that ripple effect playing out in real time right now with Texas Representative Marc Veasey. His story is just a perfect example of how federal map-drawing battles translate into local political chaos.
Oh, absolutely. So Representative Veasey has been a fixture in Congress since 2012. In 2024, he won his District 33 seat with a commanding 68.7% of the vote. He is politically secure.
Very secure.
But then, right before the filing deadline, in a completely unexpected move, he drops his congressional re-election bid.
Which is wild. Walking away from a safely won congressional seat is almost unheard of in modern politics. Why abandon a seat you just won by a landslide?
Well, Veasey specifically blames racially gerrymandered maps. He argues that the newly drawn maps in North Texas systematically weakened the broader power of Black and Latino voters.
Yeah.
So even though his own specific seat was safe, the boundaries of his district and the surrounding areas shifted so drastically that he felt his community's overall voice was being marginalized.
So he decides he can no longer fight effectively from Washington, D.C. when the very foundation of his district is being hollowed out.
Right. So he makes a strategic pivot. Instead of running for Congress, he announces he's running for Tarrant County judge against the Republican incumbent Tim O'Hare. Veasey states that he wants to fight local extremism right in his own backyard.
It's a fascinating calculation. Basically, he's deciding that if the national map is rigged against his coalition, the only way to protect his constituents is to seize control of the local municipal levers of power.
Exactly. And the frustration driving Veasey's decision is echoed loudly by his colleagues back in Washington. Following the Supreme Court ruling, the Congressional Black Caucus, or CBC, releases an intensely worded statement. They call the Louisiana ruling a death certificate for the Voting Rights Act.
Wow. A death certificate.
Yeah. They argue it undoes decades of civil rights progress and allows politicians to essentially manufacture their own electorates. And the CBC goes beyond just issuing condemnations. They outline specific, aggressive demands.
Right. They demand that Congress immediately pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to basically bypass the Supreme Court's new framework. Furthermore, they push for establishing term limits for Supreme Court justices, explicitly labeling the current court as rogue and compromised.
The rhetoric here is just explosive.
It is. I mean, words like death certificate, rogue, compromise, these aren't just standard political disagreements, right? They are attacks on the legitimacy of the institutions themselves. And when politicians use language this severe, you really have to ask what the actual goal is. Does telling voters that the system is entirely rigged and the courts are rogue actually mobilize people to show up at the ballot box?
Or does it just convince them that voting is pointless and add fuel to an already burning fire?
Right. It feels like we are looking at a society acting like a powder keg.
And that tension is the defining feature of our current political climate. Because when trust in the legal and electoral system breaks down, the language becomes extreme. People begin to feel deeply vulnerable. And as the documents in front of us show, when the political temperature rises to this level, the distance between heated rhetoric and terrifying physical violence becomes dangerously short.
Which brings us back to that crowded ballroom in Washington, D.C. The attempted assassination at the White House Correspondents' dinner is like the physical manifestation of all this systemic vulnerability.
Yeah, the timeline of the attack is just chilling. So it's around 8:30 p.m. Former President Donald Trump is seated near the front of the ballroom. The mentalist, Oz Perlman, is on stage doing crowd work, trying to guess the name of a staffer's baby. The mood is light. Then, a loud bang echoes through the room.
And at first, attendees, including Trump, actually hope a waiter simply dropped a tray of dishes. But it's gunfire.
It's gunfire. But the response from law enforcement is a masterclass in tactical speed. The statistics are staggering here. Secret Service agents and counter-assault teams completely surround Trump in just 10 seconds.
10 seconds? That's unbelievable.
I know. They managed to evacuate the vice president from the room in a matter of seconds. From the moment the first shot is fired to the moment the threat is neutralized, the entire confrontation with the shooter lasts exactly 7 seconds.
7 seconds. The speed of that violence is hard to comprehend, and the shooter is identified as Cole Thomas Allen, and his background is highly complex. He's described as a highly educated individual who attended Caltech. However, the investigation reveals a path of severe radicalization.
Right. He abandoned his Christian faith, recently attended a protest movement known as No Kings, and right before stepping into that ballroom, he emailed a detailed manifesto to his family, targeting specific administration officials.
It's a scenario that highlights just how fragile the bubble of security really is. Miraculously, no one is killed in the attack. One Secret Service agent does take a direct hit from a bullet, but survives entirely thanks to his bulletproof vest. The system held, but just barely.
Yeah, barely is the word. In the aftermath, Donald Trump sits down for an interview with Norah O'Donnell. His perspective on surviving the attempt is deeply revealing because he immediately places it into a broader historical context. He doesn't just focus on the shooter. He focuses on what the shooting represents about his role in the country.
Right. He cites a specific historical pattern. He points out that consequential presidents, leaders who fundamentally alter the direction of the nation, inevitably face assassination attempts. He lists Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, and Teddy Roosevelt. His argument is that leaders who do things and actively disrupt the status quo automatically become targets for radicalized violence.
And during that same interview, he defends the controversial policies that he believes make him a target, particularly regarding immigration. He claims that he inherited a border where 25 million people came into the country, including individuals he classifies as criminals. He argues that taking severe, unapologetic action on national security issues naturally provokes extreme reactions from unstable individuals.
But the fallout from those 7 seconds of gunfire extends far beyond television interviews, doesn't it? It sparks an immediate, fierce debate about the physical architecture of the White House and how we protect our government. Trump demands the construction of a brand new, highly secure ballroom directly on the White House grounds.
Yeah, he argues that relying on standard hotel ballrooms in downtown D.C. for major political events is just a massive security liability. Hotels simply lack the built-in infrastructure to handle modern threats.
But this proposal for a new White House ballroom immediately faces strong pushback. And one of the loudest critics is someone we literally just discussed, Representative Marc Veasey.
Oh yeah, Veasey vehemently opposes the construction. He calls the proposed ballroom an ugly monstrosity. He argues that attaching a massive fortified bunker to the White House completely ruins the historic, period-correct architecture of the building. He views it as erasing history in the name of fear.
And Veasey's argument is that building a new structure doesn't even solve the root failure of the attack. He points to reports noting that security at the hotel dinner was dangerously lax. Instead of pouring concrete for a new building on the White House lawn, he demands an overhaul of security protocols.
Right. He advocates for strict ID checks, mandatory metal detectors, and securing entire hotel properties exclusively for these events, rather than trying to wall off the executive branch in a permanent fortress.
If we look at this debate, it perfectly mirrors the anxiety we saw in the courtroom earlier. Are we fixing the actual threat, or are we just building higher walls? Like, if you build a bunker on the White House lawn to keep politicians safe from the public, do you actually solve the anger and radicalization brewing outside those walls? Or do you just isolate the leaders from the very people they're supposed to represent?
That's the core question, isn't it? Because we're watching a simultaneous transformation here. We're watching the physical architecture of our government change in response to real-world violence, just as we're watching the legal architecture of our voting system change in response to the courts. Both are defensive reactions to a system under immense stress.
When we pull all these threads together, the picture is profound. We started at the highest court in the land, watching the Supreme Court rewrite the rules of the Voting Rights Act, changing the math of how minority votes are weighed and how our neighborhoods are divided. We watched seasoned politicians like Marc Veasey look at those new rules, realize the federal map is stacked against them, and flee the halls of Congress to fight battles on the local county level. And then we heard the echo of gunfire in a Washington ballroom, a stark reminder of the physical dangers hovering over the executive branch.
Every single document we reviewed today, from Alito's majority opinion to the shooter's manifesto, it all shows an American democratic system facing stress tests on every conceivable front. The rules of how you vote, who represents you, and how your leaders are physically protected, they're not static. They are changing rapidly in real time right in front of us.
And the mechanics of these changes matter to you because they dictate the reality of your daily life. These court rulings decide the boundary lines of your neighborhood and whether your vote feels impactful or diluted. These political shifts decide whose names appear on your local ballot. And these security debates decide how your cities operate when leaders come to town.
Which leaves us with a critical thought for you to explore on your own. If we continually rely on the judicial system to draw our political boundaries because we just can't agree on fair representation, and we rely on the Secret Service to build literal, physical walls around our politicians because the threat of violence is too high, the dynamic of our republic shifts.
It really does.
At what point do the American people stop being active participants in a shared democracy and start just being spectators, looking in from the outside of a system that has walled itself off?
A shocking assassination attempt in a crowded ballroom and a massive Supreme Court ruling in a quiet chamber. The gavel and the gun. The rules are changing, the walls are getting higher, and the mechanics of democracy are being rewritten in the middle of the crash. Keep your eyes open.